cutters biting through heavy-gauge copper don't snap. They make a wet, thick crunch. I stood on my porch, bitter coffee cooling in my hand, watching three men in cheap vests sever my home's connection to the grid. Iris from the HOA sent them. Iris didn't know I owned the grid. The air in Oak Creek Estates always smelled faintly of chemicals. It was a sterile, engineered scent, a mix of high-nitrogen fertilizer, evaporating sprinkler water, and whatever aggressive weed killer the landscaping crews sprayed on Tuesday mornings. It smelled like control. I hated it. I've hated it for 3 years. But the house still held the faint, lingering trace of Sarah's vanilla candles in the upstairs hallway. And the kitchen tiles still had the tiny chip by the island where she dropped a cast-iron skillet back in 2018. You don't abandon the only physical anchors you have left just because the neighbors are insufferable. So I stayed. I paid my dues. I watched the meticulously curated world outside my window with the detached exhaustion of a man who spent his days dealing with much larger, uglier realities. My name is Albert. I'm 54 years old. I sleep about 4 hours a night, and my lower back feels like it's filled with ground glass when it rains. I am also the majority shareholder and chief executive of Cascade Regional Power, the utility company that provides electricity to a 3-county radius, including the pristine, manicured boundaries of Oak Creek Estates. No one in the neighborhood knew this. Why would they? I didn't drive a sports car. I drove a dented 2016 Ford F-15. Oh, that squeaked when I took a left turn. I wore faded denim and boots that had seen actual mud. To the residents of Oak Creek, a collection of mid-level tech managers, aggressive real estate brokers, and retired dentists, I was just the sullen widower at the end of Elmwood Drive who didn't attend the block parties. And to Iris Carmichael, president of the Homeowners Association, I was a blemish. Iris smelled like cloying, synthetic gardenias and hairspray. She was a woman in her late 50s who wielded the HOA bylaws like a holy text. The friction between us started over a utility box. Because of the nature of my work and my need to have absolute, uninterrupted access to grid monitoring software, even during catastrophic weather events, I had a custom, heavy-duty sub-panel and backup transfer switch installed on the side of my house. It was a massive industrial piece of hardware. It was cast iron and brushed steel, built to withstand a Category 4 hurricane. It was also, according to Iris, the wrong shade of beige. She caught me in the driveway on a sweltering Tuesday evening in late August. The heat radiating off the asphalt was thick enough to chew. I had just finished a 14-hour shift, negotiating a nightmare contract dispute with the linemen's union, and my head was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. "Albert!" she called out. She didn't walk. She marched. Her heels clicked aggressively against the pavement. I leaned against the side of my truck, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second. "Evening, Iris. I left 3 notices on your door," she said, stopping a socially precise 5 feet away. She was holding a clipboard. People like Iris always have a clipboard. "The electrical monstrosity on the east elevation of your property. It's an eyesore, Albert. It violates Section 4, Paragraph B of the Architectural Harmony Guidelines." I looked at the box. It was gray, a highly functional, weather-resistant gray. "It's utility equipment, Iris. It's code compliant." "It is not painted desert sand," she countered, her voice tightening. "Everything visible from the street must be desert sand, or autumn whisper. We cannot have industrial gray in Oak Creek. It brings down property values. You need to paint it, or box it in with approved cedar lattice." My jaw clenched. I could have explained it to her right then. I could have told her that painting a high-voltage, heat-dissipating enclosure with cheap, latex exterior paint was a massive fire hazard. I could have told her that covering it in dry wood lattice was a violation of federal safety standards. I could have simply handed her my business card, which had the Cascade Regional Power logo embossed in the corner, and watched the blood drain from her face. But I was tired. I was so profoundly, existentially tired. And a dark, stubborn part of my brain, the part that missed my wife, the part that hated this sterile neighborhood, refused to give her an inch. I'm not painting the heat sink, Iris. It'll start a fire. I grabbed my briefcase from the passenger seat. The bylaws are not optional, Albert, she barked, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet, stifling suburban air. If you do not rectify the infraction, the association will hire a contractor to bring the property into compliance at your expense. I didn't look back. I just walked up my driveway, the keys jingling in my hand. Have a good night, Iris, I muttered, shutting the heavy oak door behind me, instantly enveloping myself in the cool, silent, lonely air of my house. I thought she was just venting hot air. I underestimated the sheer, terrifying momentum of a bored person with a tiny sliver of authority. September came, bringing with it a drop in humidity and a deluge of neon pink envelopes. They arrived via certified mail. First, a warning, then a $50 fine, then a $150 fine. The language in the letters grew increasingly hostile, shifting from polite neighborly reminders to the kind of pseudo-legal jargon that people copy and paste from the internet. Failure to comply will result in a lien against the property. The association reserves the right to cure the defect via third-party intervention. I threw them in the kitchen trash, right on top of the wet coffee grounds. My days were bleeding into one another. Cascade Regional Power was undergoing a massive multi-million-dollar infrastructure overhaul. We were replacing aging transformers in the northern sector, dealing with supply chain delays that made my purchasing directors want to jump out of windows. I was spending my afternoons staring at schematic blueprints and arguing with state regulators over rate adjustments. I was dealing in gigawatts, in millions of dollars, in the terrifying reality that if my company failed, hospitals would go dark and people on ventilators would die. Iris's obsession with the color desert sand felt like a static hiss in the background of my life. It was so absurd, it barely registered as a threat. In hindsight, my inaction wasn't heroic. It was a symptom of my own depression. A healthier man would have called his lawyer. A more adjusted man would have sent an email with the federal codes attached, shutting down the HOA board legally and swiftly. But I didn't care enough to engage. I was self-medicating with an expensive bottle of Lagavulin every night, sitting in the dark in my living room, listening to the silence of the house, letting the pink letters pile up on the entryway table until they fell onto the hardwood floor. By mid-October, the tone of the letters shifted. The latest one, which arrived on a Thursday, was taped directly to my front door. The adhesive left a sticky residue on the wood, which irritated me more than the words on the page. Final notice. Property owner, Albert Pendleton. As you have ignored all previous communications and fines totaling $1,450, the Oak Creek Estates HOA board has voted to take physical action. On Tuesday, October 22nd, a contracted crew will arrive at the premises to rectify the unapproved electrical installation. As the unapproved box represents a structural anomaly, it will be decoupled from the primary aesthetic facade. All costs will be billed to your resident account. I stood on the porch, reading the letter under the harsh glare of the porch light. Decoupled. What an incredibly stupid word for someone who clearly had no idea what they were looking at. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the rough stubble on my jaw. They were threatening to tamper with a live 200-amp utility line. The sheer idiocy of it made my chest tight. I took my phone out of my pocket. I had the number for the local police precinct right there. I could have called them. I could have called my chief of security at Cascade and had a company patrol car parked in my driveway. But as I stared at the letter, a heavy, cynical apathy washed over me. I looked down the street at Iris's house. Her perfectly manicured lawn was illuminated by warm white LED uplighting. Everything about her world was safe, sanitized, and deeply ignorant of how the real world functioned. She thought electricity was magic that lived behind drywall. She thought rules written on a clipboard trumped physics. Let them try, I thought, a bitter, ugly feeling settling in my stomach. Let them come, paint the box. I assumed they would show up with some sandpaper and a bucket of beige paint, realize they couldn't paint over industrial safety seals, and leave. I crushed the letter in my fist and went inside. I poured myself a drink. I didn't set an alarm. Tuesday morning, October 22nd. I woke up with a dry mouth and a dull pressure behind my eyes. The clock on the nightstand glowed 8:14 a.m. I was late. I was supposed to be in a board meeting at 9, but the thought of putting on a tie made me want to crawl out of my own skin. I dragged myself out of bed, the hardwood floor cold against my bare feet, and shuffled down to the kitchen. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, turning the knob. The blue flame flared to life. As I reached for the jar of instant coffee, a terrible habit I couldn't break, I heard a sound outside. It was the heavy crunch of tires on gravel, followed by the metallic shh of a sliding van door opening. I paused, spoon midway to the mug. I walked over to the kitchen window and pushed aside the heavy blinds. A battered white Ford Econoline van was parked half in my driveway, half on the pristine Bermuda grass of my lawn. There was no company logo on the side, just a faded sticker from a local auto body shop on the bumper. Two men stepped out. They were wearing faded jeans and bright yellow, unbranded high-vis vests that looked like they were bought at a hardware store clearance bin. One of them, a heavy-set guy smoking a cheap cigarillo, was carrying a large red toolbox. The other, younger, with a dirty baseball cap pulled low, was holding a pair of massive, yellow-handled bolt cutters. My pulse kicked up a notch. The haze of the morning burned away, replaced by a sharp, sudden spike of adrenaline. They weren't here to paint. I watched as they walked straight toward the side of the house, disappearing from my line of sight through the kitchen window. I moved quickly, my bare feet slapping against the tile, heading toward the side door in the laundry room. I opened the door just a crack. The air outside smelled of dead autumn leaves and the sharp, acrid smoke of the cigarillo. They were standing right in front of the sub-panel. "Lady said it's the ugly gray box," the older guy mumbled, pointing the glowing tip of his smoke at my custom enclosure. "Said we gotta rip it out so the real electricians can put a smaller one inside the garage." "Looks heavy," the younger one said, tapping the thick, insulated conduit that ran from the ground up into the bottom of the box. "We supposed to just cut it." She said it's just an ugly add-on. "Illegal installation. Unplug it, cut the lines, cap them. Easy $500. The older guy popped the latches on his red toolbox. My brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. The conduit they were looking at wasn't a standard residential feed. Because of my security and monitoring setups, my house was fed by a commercial-grade line directly from the neighborhood's main subterranean transformer, which sat on the easement between my property and the street. If they cut that line while it was live, they wouldn't just lose power. The arc flash would vaporize the metal, and likely their hands. "Hey!" I yelled, shoving the laundry room door open. I stepped out onto the cold concrete patio. "Step away from the box." The two men jumped. The younger one lowered the bolt cutters. The older guy frowned, squinting at me. I was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, my hair a mess. I didn't look like a CEO. I looked like a crazy old man. "You the homeowner?" the older guy asked, not sounding particularly intimidated. "I am." "And you are trespassing," I said, my voice shaking slightly, not from fear but from the massive dump of adrenaline in my system. "Do not touch that conduit. It is carrying 200 amps of raw current. It will kill you." The guy smirked, taking a long drag from his cigarillo. "Look, buddy, we got a work order from the HOA, Iris Carmichael. She said you'd throw a fit. Said this is a fake box you put up to run some illegal Bitcoin mining crap. We're just doing our job." "Iris Carmichael is an idiot," I snarled, taking a step forward. "I own this property. You do not have my consent. If you touch that line, I will have you arrested for tampering with critical infrastructure." The younger guy looked nervous. He glanced at his partner. "Oh, maybe we should call her, man. He sounds serious." "He sounds like a guy trying to get out of a fine," the older man said dismissively. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a heavy rubber mat. He threw it on the ground in front of the box. At least he has basic grounding sense, a tiny analytical part of my brain noted. But he wasn't wearing insulated gloves. He wasn't wearing an arc flash suit. "I am warning you," I said, my voice dropping to a low, hard register. "I work for the power company. That line is live. You are going to blow yourselves up." Yeah. Everyone works for the power company when the repo man comes." The older guy laughed. He grabbed the bolt cutters from the younger kid. "Step back, Pops. This'll just take a second." I froze. Time seemed to slow down. I should have tackled him. I should have physically thrown myself between him and the box. But the sheer, immovable obstinacy of the situation paralyzed me. He was really going to do it. He stepped onto the rubber mat. He wedged the heavy jaws of the bolt cutters around the thickest part of the insulated feed line coming from the ground. I flinched, throwing my arm up over my face, bracing for the blinding blue-white flash of an electrical explosion. He squeezed the handles together with a grunt. Ike. Crunch. It was a wet, thick, terrible sound. The sound of solid copper yielding under immense pressure. I waited for the boom. I waited for the smell of burning ozone and flesh. Nothing happened. I lowered my arm. The older guy was breathing hard, a smug smile on his face. The thick, black cable hung loose, severed cleanly in two. No sparks, no explosion. For a split second, I was confused. Why wasn't there an arc? Then the profound silence hit me. The low, omnipresent hum of the central air conditioning unit on the side of the house died. The faint buzz of the neighborhood's grid vanished. I looked past the men toward the street. The automated sprinkler system on my neighbor's lawn, which ran precisely at 8:30 a.m. every day, sputtered and collapsed into the grass. The older guy wiped his forehead. "See, deadline. Just an illegal dummy box." I stared at the severed cable. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a cold, dark realization washing over me like ice water. Huck, it wasn't a deadline. It was a live line. But it didn't arc because he didn't just cut my power. Cascade Regional Power had recently installed hypersensitive, automated fail-safes on all commercial-grade suburban transformers to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic arcing and prevent wildfires. If the system detected a sudden, violent severing of a massive load line, a short to ground caused by a giant metal tool, the smart grid software didn't just trip a local breaker. It assumed a catastrophic event had occurred, like a backhoe hitting a main line or a car crashing into a pole. To prevent feedback and fire, it instantly severed the connection at the node. The node wasn't just my house. The node was the primary feed for the entire Whispering Pine subdivision. I slowly looked up at the sky. A flock of birds, startled by the sudden mechanical silence, took off from a nearby oak tree. I looked down the street. Iris's house, usually humming with landscape lights and pond pumps, sat utterly, completely dead. The contractor dropped the bolt cutters into the dirt. "All right, phase 1 done. Let's get the crowbars and pry this ugly box off the wall." A laugh bubbled up in my chest. It wasn't a happy sound. It was rough, broken, and deeply cynical. It scraped my throat as it came out. "What's so funny?" the guy asked, looking at me like I had lost my mind. I looked at him, then at his cheap van parked on my grass, and finally at the severed $1 million piece of infrastructure at his feet. "You didn't just cut my power, you absolute moron," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the sheer magnitude of the incoming chaos settling comfortably over my shoulders. "You just cut the power to 400 homes, and you did it on a commercial utility line." The older man's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer him. I turned around, walked back into my house, and let the door click shut. The kitchen was plunged into shadows. The stove clock was dark. I walked over to the counter, picked up my cell phone, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Marcus. No, I couldn't call Marcus. He transferred to the Northern Grid last year. I found the number for David, my chief operating officer at Cascade Regional Power. It rang twice. "Albert," David answered, sounding stressed. We just got a massive red flag on the board. Total uncommanded blackout in Sector 4. Whispering Pines. The automated safety tripped hard. It looks like a physical breach on a commercial node. I leaned against the cool granite of my kitchen island. The house was already losing its warmth. "I know, David," I said softly, staring out the window at the two men who were now frantically trying to call someone on their cell phones. "Someone just cut the main feed to my house." "Jesus," David breathed. "Are you okay? Who did it?" "A couple of unlicensed guys in a white van," I replied. I felt a slow, terrible grin spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in months. "Send the Federal Emergency Response Crew. Send the heavy trucks. Send legal." "And David?" "Yeah, Albert. Bill the entire emergency response, the infrastructure repair, and the grid downtime penalties to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I paused, listening to the heavy silence of the house. Care of Iris Carmichael. The true terrifying sound of a blackout isn't the initial click of the power dying. It's the creeping, suffocating silence that follows. Within 10 minutes, the background radiation of modern suburban life evaporated. The distant hum of refrigerator compressors, the low drone of pool pumps, the rhythmic thwack-thwack of lawn sprinklers, all of it ceased. The world shrank down to the sound of the wind, rustling the brittle oak leaves, and the panicked, hushed voices of the two contractors on my lawn. The older man had dropped his cigarillo. It lay burning a small, neat hole into my chemically treated Bermuda grass. He was staring at the severed black cable like it was a venomous snake that had just bitten him. "Caller," he croaked, his bravado entirely stripped away. He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving dark streaks of grease and copper dust. "Call the HOA lady, now." The younger kid pulled his phone out, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it in the dirt. I stayed in the kitchen. I poured my lukewarm, bitter instant coffee down the stainless steel sink. I didn't feel the righteous, triumphant thrill I thought I would. Instead, a hollow, leaden weight settled in my gut. I had let this happen. I was a man who managed the safety of millions, and I had allowed two underpaid, unlicensed idiots to sever a commercial feed because I was too spiteful and too depressed to simply paint a piece of metal or answer a letter. It was an ugly truth, and it tasted like ash in my mouth. I walked out the front door, the heavy wood closing with a solid, final thud behind me. Neighbors were beginning to spill out onto the sidewalks. Doors opened cautiously. A woman across the street, wearing a silk bathrobe and holding a crying toddler, looked up at the sky as if expecting to see an eclipse. The automated garage doors were dead. Cars were trapped. The illusion of self-sufficiency in Oak Creek Estates was shattering in real time. And then, the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of sensible heels on pavement cut through the quiet. Iris Carmichael was marching down the center of Elmwood Drive. She was flanked by two other members of the HOA board, a retired dentist named Greg and a pale woman whose name I never bothered to learn. Iris was holding her clipboard. She wore a tailored beige blazer, completely out of place for a Tuesday morning, but perfectly suited for a woman who viewed herself as a general surveying a conquered territory. She saw the white van on my grass. She saw me standing on the porch, her posture straightened, a smug, tight-lipped smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Albert," she called out, projecting her voice so the gathering neighbors could hear. "I see the contractors have arrived. I warned you this would happen. The association does not make idle threats." I walked down the steps. The morning air was biting, settling into the fabric of my thin t-shirt. I stopped at the edge of my driveway, placing myself between her and the side of the house where the contractors were hiding. "You cut the power, Iris," I said. My voice was flat, no anger, just exhaustion. "Just don't be dramatic," she scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "The contractors simply decoupled your illegal installation. The grid for the neighborhood is completely fine. I suspect a local breaker tripped at the subdivision entrance. Greg is calling the utility company now." Behind her, Greg was holding a cell phone to his ear, looking increasingly pale. "It's a busy signal, Iris." The automated system says there's a catastrophic grid failure. Nonsense, Iris snapped. She turned back to me, raising the clipboard. You will be receiving an invoice for the contractor's time, Albert, and I expect that eyesore removed from the property by the end of the week. A deep, low rumble vibrated up through the soles of my boots. It started as a physical sensation before it became a sound. The asphalt seemed to tremble. Iris paused, her mouth half open. The neighbors turned their heads toward the entrance of the subdivision. Over the tree line, the flashing glare of heavy amber strobes painted the morning sky. The first vehicle to turn onto Elmwood Drive wasn't a standard utility pickup. It was a Cascade Regional Power heavy-duty incident response truck, a massive 10-ton diesel behemoth painted bright hazard yellow, sporting a hydraulic crane on the back. It was followed by a trenching tractor, an enclosed mobile command SUV, and 2 local police cruisers with their light bars blazing, sirens completely silent. The convoy didn't stop at the neighborhood entrance. It rolled slowly, massively down the pristine street, the deep roar of the diesel engines drowning out everything else. They parked directly in front of my house, the heavy truck's tires crushing Iris's precious roadside flower beds into the mud. Iris stumbled back, her eyes wide, clutching the clipboard to her chest as if it were a shield. What is this? Who called an emergency crew? The doors of the trucks opened. A dozen men and women wearing thick, fire-resistant Nomex suits, hard hats, and insulated rubber gloves poured out. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized speed of a military unit. Orange traffic cones were thrown onto the asphalt. Heavy caution tape was dragged across my property line. A tall man in a crisp, white hard hat and a high-visibility jacket stepped out of the command SUV. He had a radio clipped to his shoulder and a tablet in his hand. It was David, my COO. He looked exhausted, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the chaos until they locked onto me. "Hey, you can't park those heavy machines on the pavement. You'll crack the sealant," Iris shrieked, finding her voice. She stepped toward David, waving her clipboard. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association, and I demand you move these vehicles immediately." David didn't even look at her. He walked straight past her, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped 2 feet in front of me. "Site secure?" David asked, his voice strictly professional, but I could see the furious tension in his eyes. "2 men, unlicensed." I pointed toward the side of the house. "They're still over there. They used bolt cutters on the primary commercial feed line, ground to box. They severed it completely." David let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. He clicked his radio. "Team Alpha, we have a severed primary line on the east elevation. Treat it as a live hazard until the substation confirms the node is isolated. Get the police over there to detain the individuals on site." 2 police officers immediately unclipped their radios and jogged toward the side of my house. A second later, I heard the older contractor yell, "Hey, we were just following orders." Iris pushed her way past a utility worker, her face flushed a blotchy, uneven red. "Excuse me, who is in charge here? You are trespassing on private property. The HOA authorized a simple box removal." David finally turned to look at her. He didn't look angry. He looked at her the way a biologist looks at a particularly destructive insect. "Ma'am," David said, his voice carrying the heavy, authoritative weight of corporate liability. "This is a federal incident site. You need to step back behind the barricade immediately." "I am the HOA president," Iris screamed, her voice cracking, the sterile control she so desperately craved slipping violently through her fingers. "You are talking to one of the residents. You work for the power company. You answer to us." David blinked. He looked at me, a silent, grim question in his eyes. I gave him a small, exhausted nod. "Ma'am," David said slowly, articulating every word with deliberate precision, "I answer to the Chief Executive Officer of Cascade Regional Power," which is exactly who I am talking to. David gestured toward me. Iris stopped breathing. The color drained from her face so quickly that the applied rouge on her cheeks looked like 2 fresh bruises. She stared at me, then down at my faded jeans. then back up to my face. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. "Albert," she whispered, the words sounding hollow, stripped of all its previous condescension. I looked at her. Oh yeah, I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt the cold air biting at my arms and the aching void in my chest where my wife used to be. "You should have let me keep the box gray, Iris," I said quietly. By noon, my front lawn was destroyed. The sterile scent of chemical fertilizer was entirely replaced by the sharp, earthy smell of deep, wet clay and the acrid stench of diesel exhaust. The trenching machine had ripped a massive, jagged scar through the Bermuda grass, exposing the subterranean conduit that fed the neighborhood. The hydraulic hum of the heavy machinery rattled the windows of my house. I stood on the porch, wearing a heavy canvas jacket I had pulled from the hall closet, drinking a fresh cup of coffee David had brought me from the command vehicle. The two contractors were gone. They had been placed in the back of a police cruiser in handcuffs. Tampering with a commercial utility line, regardless of intent, carried severe federal penalties. Ignorance was not a defense when you wielded bolt cutters against the grid. Iris was still there. She hadn't moved from the sidewalk in 2 hours. The other board members had vanished, retreating to the safety of their cold, dark homes the moment the police began taking statements. But Iris stayed, clutching her clipboard, her tailored blazer looking crumpled and absurd against the backdrop of industrial chaos. She looked small. David walked up the driveway, a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. He stepped onto the porch, wiping dirt from his hands. "Line is capped and secure," David said, leaning against the wooden railing. "They're prepping the splice now. It's a mess, Albert. They tore up 6 feet of the primary heavy-gauge copper. We have to pull a whole new feed from the street transformer." "Timeline?" I asked, watching a worker in a mud-caked suit guide a heavy crane hooked down into the trench. 3, maybe 4 hours. We'll have the neighborhood back online before sunset." David sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The regulators are already breathing down my neck. The automated system logged it as a terror-level infrastructure breach. We had to file the paperwork to stand down the State Emergency Management Agency." "I know. I'm sorry, David. I should have—" I trailed off. There was no excuse. I let it go too far. "You did," David agreed, pulling no punches. He was a good man. He didn't sugarcoat things for me, not even when I was the boss. "Oh, but the legal team isn't looking at you. They're looking at the paper trail." He pulled a thick stack of papers from the manila folder. It was a preliminary itemized damage assessment. We pulled the HOA bylaws and the work order the contractor provided. David explained, flipping to the second page. "The contractor's insurance maxes out at 50 grand. That won't even cover the dispatch fee for the heavy trucks. Cascade Legal is holding the HOA directly liable as the authorizing entity." I looked down at the bottom line. The number printed there was staggering. The cost of replacing commercial-grade infrastructure, the emergency weekend rate labor for 30 crew members, the environmental hazard fees, and the cascading grid downtime penalties levied by the state. It was deep into the 6 figures. "Take it to her," I said, my voice heavy. David nodded. He walked down the driveway, approaching the caution tape where Iris stood frozen. I watched from the porch. I couldn't hear what David was saying over the roar of the generators, but I saw the exact moment the reality of the situation crushed her. David handed her the assessment. Iris took it with trembling hands. She read the first page, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. Then she flipped to the back, her knees buckled. She didn't fall to the ground, but she swayed so violently she had to grab the orange plastic barricade to stay upright. The clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the asphalt. The wind caught the neatly printed violation notices attached to it, scattering them across the mud and the torn-up earth. She looked up at me. There was no anger left in her expression, no authority, just raw, unadulterated terror. The kind of terror that comes when the protective, sanitized bubble you've built your entire life around violently pops, exposing you to the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the real world. If they levied a special assessment to cover the bill, Every homeowner in Oak Creek would be financially gutted. They would lose their homes. Iris would be sued into oblivion by her own neighbors. Her perfectly manicured life was over. I looked at her, standing in the cold, and I felt nothing. No joy, no pity. Just an overwhelming sense of finality. I turned away and walked back inside the house. The house was freezing now. The temperature had dropped into the low 50s. I kept my heavy jacket on and walked into the living room. It was dark, the heavy curtains drawn. I sat down in my armchair, the leather stiff and cold against my back. I closed my eyes and listened. I didn't listen to the heavy machinery outside or the muffled shouts of the crew. I listened to the house. I listened for the creak of the floorboards upstairs or the clink of a coffee mug in the kitchen. The sounds Sarah used to make. The sounds that made this house a home before it became a sterile box in a neighborhood of strangers. Nothing, just the heavy, crushing weight of my own solitude. Winning a war against Iris didn't fix the broken things inside me. It didn't bring back the light I actually cared about. It just proved that I could be as ruthless and destructive as I needed to be to protect my isolation. Hours passed. The cold seeped deeper into my bones. And then, just as the last gray light of dusk began to bleed through the edges of the curtains, there was a sharp, mechanical clack from the utility room. The refrigerator hummed to life. The digital clock on the microwave beeped, flashing 12 o'clock. The ambient, low-level vibration of modern electricity returned to the walls. The power was back. The grid was whole. I sat in the dark living room, surrounded by the invisible currents of energy that I controlled, feeling completely and utterly powerless. If you enjoyed this raw, emotional dive into the heavy consequences of suburban entitlement, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who hates HOA overreach as much as we do. It helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm to bring you more grounded, deeply human stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next upload. Leave a comment below. How would you have handled Iris? Let's talk about it.